In 1903, police raided the richest bachelor in Paris. They didn't find a party. They found a black mass involving elite schoolboys and Greek altars. Baron Fersen sacrificed a steel fortune to worship forbidden male beauty. From Parisian scandals to an opium-fueled suicide in Capri, this is the story of a man destroyed by his own decadence. He was born into the dying breath of the 19th century, a time we now call the Belle Époque. It was an era of golden surfaces and rotting interiors. Paris was the center of the universe, a city of electric lights, world fairs, and unbridled optimism. But beneath the polite society of the salons and the opera houses, there was a deep, pervasive boredom. The aristocracy was losing its power to the industrialists. And in that vacuum, a new kind of religion emerged: aestheticism. Jacques was the high priest of this new religion. Born in 1880, he was the heir to a massive steel fortune, a blend of Swedish nobility and French industrial wealth. He had the money to buy countries, but he had the soul of a poet who found the modern world unbearably ugly. He was 20 years old, impossibly wealthy, and arguably one of the most eligible bachelors in France. He could have been a captain of industry. He could have been a diplomat. Instead, he chose to be a dandy. But Jacques was not just a man who liked nice clothes. For him, aestheticism wasn't a hobby, it was a survival mechanism. He looked at the gray, industrializing world around him, the factories his family owned, the smoke, the noise, the endless pursuit of profit, and he felt a physical revulsion. He retreated into the past. He read the Greeks and the Romans. He obsessed over the concept of the Greek love, the idealized mentorship and romantic connection between an older man and a younger youth, as described by Plato. He convinced himself that the modern world had lost its way because it had forgotten how to worship beauty. This wasn't just an intellectual exercise, it was a dangerous game. In 1903, France was still reeling from the shock of the Oscar Wilde trial in England just a few years prior. The world had made it very clear. Society would tolerate eccentricity, but it would destroy anyone who crossed the line into immorality. Jacques, with the arrogance of inherited wealth, believed he was above the law. He believed that because his intentions were artistic, the rules of common morality did not apply to him. He was wrong. He bought a lavish apartment on the Avenue de Friedland in Paris. It wasn't just a home, it was a stage set. He designed it to shut out the reality of 1903 Paris. Inside, he created a temple dedicated to his own personal gods. He published poetry books that few people read, but everyone talked about because of their undeniable undertones of melancholy and forbidden desire. He was trying to signal to others like him, trying to find a tribe in a city that forced men like him to live in shadows. The press would later call them black masses, invoking images of Satan worship, blood sacrifices, and demonic chanting. This was a lie, a fabrication by journalists who knew that fear sold newspapers. What actually happened inside the apartment on Avenue de Friedland was far more complex and, in a way, far more tragic. Jacques wasn't worshiping the devil. He was worshiping the concept of youth. He began inviting high school students, boys from the most prestigious schools in Paris, Lycée Carnot and Lycée Condorcet, to his apartment. These were not street urchins. They were the sons of the bourgeoisie, educated and articulate. Jacques directed them in what were known as tableaux vivants, living pictures. This was a popular parlor game at the time, where guests would dress up and freeze in poses to recreate famous paintings or historical scenes. But Jacques took it to an extreme. He stripped away the Victorian costumes. He wanted to recreate the scenes of antiquity with total fidelity. He had the boys pose as figures from Greek mythology, Ganymede being abducted by the eagle, Narcissus staring into the pool, Saint Sebastian pierced by arrows. He used lighting, incense, and poetry to create a thick, dreamlike atmosphere. He would recite verses while the boys held their poses, their bodies illuminated by soft candlelight against velvet drapes. To the outside world, this looked like a predatory ring of corruption. To Jacques, it was a religious service. He truly believed he was educating these young men, elevating them from the mundane existence of schoolwork and future office jobs into the realm of high art. He saw himself not as a corrupter, but as a curator. He was freezing them in their moment of peak perfection before they grew up, got fat, got married, and became boring, productive members of society. He wanted to keep them in the realm of the ideal. But reality has a way of breaking into even the most carefully constructed sanctuaries. You cannot run a temple of youth in the middle of Paris, involving the sons of respectable families, without attracting attention. Rumors began to circulate. The boys talked. They bragged to their friends. They whispered about the crazy baron and his poetry, about the strange hypnotic afternoon spent posing like statues, while he stared at them with an intensity that was both flattering and terrifying. The bubble burst in 1903. It wasn't a dramatic betrayal that brought him down, but the slow, grinding machinery of the law. The police had been watching him. They had reports of scandalous behavior. When they raided the apartment, they didn't find a satanic altar. They found a young man, a poet, surrounded by props and costumes, living in a delusion of his own making. The arrest of Baron Jacques de Delswerd Fersen was the scandal of the decade. The press went feral. They branded him the bambochar, a derogatory term implying a debauched party animal. They stripped away the artistic context of his actions and presented him to the public as a monster who preyed on children. They equated his aesthetic rituals with the darkest forms of depravity. The Black Mass narrative was born here. It was easier for the public to believe he was worshiping Satan than to accept that a wealthy man might be driven to ruin by a philosophical obsession with male beauty. Jacques was blindsided. He had assumed his status would protect him. He was engaged to be married to Blanche Maupas, a woman from a respectable family. The marriage was supposed to be his shield, the conventional cover that would allow him to continue his private life undisturbed. When the scandal broke, the engagement evaporated instantly. The Maupas family, terrified of the association, cut ties. His friends, the people who had drunk his champagne and praised his poetry, vanished. The hypocrisy of the Belle Époque was on full display. You could do anything you wanted as long as you weren't caught. Jacques had committed the cardinal sin of getting caught. He spent months in La Santé prison awaiting trial. The Prince of Youth was now just inmate number 1302. The solitude broke him, but it also crystallized something inside him. He realized that Paris was a lie. The society he had tried to impress, the people he had tried to emulate, were hollow. They didn't care about beauty. They cared about appearances. He began to hate them. He began to hate the gray skies of France, the rigid moral codes, the whispering neighbors. The trial was a circus. Jacques stood accused of inciting minors to debauchery. He tried to defend himself, tried to explain the artistic intent behind the tableau vivant, but the court was not interested in nuances of Greek mythology. They saw a rich pervert. However, the legal system in 1903 had its limits. The boys had not been forced. They were not strictly children in the eyes of the law regarding consent in the same way they would be today, and there was no evidence of physical coercion. The charges of black masses were proven to be journalistic fiction. He was convicted, but the sentence was relatively light, 6 months in prison and a fine of 50 francs. But the legal punishment was irrelevant. The social sentence was life without parole. He was socially dead in France. The Jockey Club, the most exclusive gentlemen's club in Paris, expelled him. His name was struck from guest lists. When he walked down the street, people crossed to the other side. He had become a pariah. It was during those dark months in prison and the humiliating aftermath that the idea of Capri began to take shape in his mind. He remembered the island from his travels. He remembered the light, the harsh, unforgiving, beautiful light of the Mediterranean. He remembered the cliffs that dropped sheer into the blue sea, the ruins of Emperor Tiberius's villas. Tiberius, another man who had been feared and reviled by Rome, who had retreated to Capri to live by his own dark rules. Jacques realized he had a choice. He could stay in Paris, a ghost haunting the edges of a society that despised him, living in the shadows of his former glory. Or he could leave. He could take his immense fortune and go somewhere where the laws of bourgeois morality did not apply. He could build a new world, not just an apartment, but a fortress, a place where he could be the emperor of his own life. He chose exile, but he knew he couldn't go alone. He needed a muse. The boys of Paris were gone, lost to the scandal. He needed someone who embodied the ideal he had almost destroyed himself trying to capture. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to meet the person who would define the rest of his life. He was about to trade the gray sophistication of Paris for the raw, sun-drenched paganism of Italy. The train ride south was a funeral procession for his old self. Baron Jacques d'Adelswerd Fersen, the Parisian dandy, was dead. He left behind the salons, the gossip, the damp streets of the capital. He was moving toward the sun. He stopped in Rome, a city of ghosts and marble, trying to figure out his next move. It was there, on a crowded street amidst the noise of the city, that he saw him. It wasn't a meticulously posed model from a high society school. It was a construction worker, a newsboy, a rough-edged Roman street kid carrying a load of bricks or shouting headlines. The accounts vary, but the impact does not. His name was Nino Cesarini. He was roughly 15 years old. He had dark eyes, wild hair, and a face that looked like it had been chipped off a Roman coin. Jacques stopped in his tracks. In Nino, he didn't just see a beautiful boy. He saw the vindication of everything he had suffered for. The Paris courts had called his obsession a sickness. Looking at Nino, Jacques felt it was a divine calling. Here was the raw material of nature, perfect and unrefined. Nino was everything Jacques was not. Poor, uneducated, rough, alive. Jacques was overcultured, neurotic, and dying inside. Nino was the cure. This meeting was the pivot point of the story. If Jacques had gone to Capri alone, he might have just been another wealthy eccentric fading into obscurity. But with Nino, he had a project. He had a living canvas. He approached the boy. He approached the boy's family in a transaction that seemed shocking to modern sensibilities, but was not uncommon in the poverty-stricken Italy of the early 20th century. Jacques made an offer. He would employ Nino. He would take him as a secretary, a companion. He would give him a life of luxury that a Roman laborer could never dream of. The family agreed. Nino agreed. And so the fallen baron and the Roman newsboy set sail for the island of Capri. They were an odd pair, the pale, elegant, scandalous aristocrat and the dark, rugged, illiterate teenager. As the ferry cut through the blue waters of the Bay of Naples, approaching the towering limestone cliffs of the island, Jacques must have felt a strange sense of victory. Paris had cast him out, but he was bringing the prize with him. Capri in the early 1900s was not yet a tourist trap. It was a wild, strange place, a haven for outcasts, eccentrics, and exiles. It was a place where foreign money bought silence and privacy. It was an island of legends, where the sirens were said to have sung to Odysseus. It was the perfect stage for the second act of Jacques' life. He didn't want to rent a house, he wanted to build a statement. He bought a piece of land on a high promontory, far away from the main village, accessible only by a steep, winding path. It was a difficult, isolated spot, perched on the edge of a sheer drop into the sea. It was dangerous. It was dramatic. It was perfect. He began to design his home. He would call it Villa Lysis. The name was a deliberate provocation. Lysis was a dialogue by Plato that discussed friendship and pederasty, the love between an older man and a younger male. By naming his house Lysis, Jacques was carving his sin into stone. He was telling the world that he was not ashamed. He was planting a flag. The construction of Villa Lysis was a monumental task. Materials had to be hauled up the mountain by donkeys. Jacques poured his fortune into the project. He wanted marble columns, gold leaf, opium dens, and vast gardens. He wanted a library filled with thousands of books. He wanted a sanctuary where he and Nino could live like gods. As the villa rose from the rock, Jacques began the transformation of Nino. This was the Pygmalion phase of his obsession. He didn't want Nino to be a rough street kid anymore. He wanted him to be Antinous, the lover of Emperor Hadrian. He hired tutors to teach Nino French and manners, but more importantly, he controlled Nino's image. He grew Nino's hair long, curling it in the style of Roman statues. He dressed him in togas, or simply let him wander the gardens like a living statue. This was not just about sexual possession. It was about artistic control. Jacques was the director, and Nino was the star of a movie that never ended. Jacques commissioned artists and photographers to capture Nino. The famous German photographer Wilhelm von Plüschow was brought in. They staged elaborate shoots in the gardens and the grottos of Capri. Nino posing with a lyre, Nino staring out at the sea, Nino as a faun. These photographs were not kept secret. Jacques published them. He wrote poems dedicated to Nino's beauty. He was doing exactly what he had done in Paris, but this time there was no police force to raid his house. Capri was a law unto itself. The locals were bemused by the strange foreign baron and his beautiful secretary, but the money Jacques poured into the local economy bought their tolerance. However, beneath the sun-drenched surface of this new paradise, the old demons were waiting. Jacques had escaped the French law, but he hadn't escaped himself. He was a man with a void in his soul that beauty alone couldn't fill. The construction of Villa Lysis was driving him to the brink of financial and emotional exhaustion. And there was the opium. It started as an affectation, a way to be like the poets he admired, Baudelaire, Rimbaud. But in the isolation of Capri, it became a crutch. Jacques discovered that the world was even more beautiful when viewed through the haze of a pipe. He built a special room in the villa, the Chinese room, located in the basement. It was a dark, womb-like space, hung with heavy tapestries, filled with the sweet, cloying scent of the poppy. Down there, time didn't exist. Down there, he didn't have to worry about the gray hairs that might one day appear on his head or on Nino's. Down there, the tableau vivant never had to move. He could lie back on the cushions, watch the smoke curl in the air, and look at Nino and believe that this moment would last forever. But the villa was not yet finished. The year was 1905. The scandal in Paris was fading into a dull ache, replaced by the frantic energy of creation in Capri. Jacques was preparing to unveil his masterpiece to the world. He was about to declare himself the king of Capri, with Nino as his prince. He was building a monument to the very thing that had destroyed his life in France. He commissioned a plaque for the front entrance of the villa. He thought long and hard about what it should say. He wanted a motto that would explain everything, a warning and a welcome to anyone who climbed the steep path to his door. He chose 3 Latin words, amori et dolori sacrum, dedicated to love and sorrow. He knew even then that you couldn't have one without the other. He knew that by loving something as fragile as youth, he was signing a contract with sorrow. He was setting the stage for a tragedy, but he was determined to make it the most beautiful tragedy the world had ever seen. The black masses of Paris were amateur theatricals compared to what he was planning for Capri. The real ritual was just beginning. Life inside the Villa Lysis settled into a rhythm that was deliberately out of step with the rest of the world. Jacques had banished the clocks. The passage of time was marked only by the movement of the sun across the marble floors and the changing colors of the sea below. He had created a hermetically sealed universe where the 20th century was strictly forbidden. There were no newspapers from the mainland, no talk of politics or the rumblings of war in Europe. There was only art, poetry, and the living, breathing presence of Nino Cesarini. Nino was the sun around which this entire artificial solar system revolved. If Jacques was the architect of this dream, Nino was the structure itself. The transformation of the Roman newsboy was now complete. The rough edges of the street urchin had been smoothed away, not to make him a gentleman. Jacques had no interest in creating another bourgeois boor, but to reveal the archetype beneath. Nino's skin, darkened by the Roman sun, was now pampered and oiled. His hair, once a tangled mess, fell in carefully curated ringlets that evoked the busts of Antinous found in the ruins of Hadrian's villa. Jacques did not treat Nino as an equal partner in a domestic arrangement. He treated him as a sacred object. The boy was given a separate wing of the villa, not to isolate him, but to preserve his mystique. Their days were structured around the liturgy of beauty. Mornings were for the body. They would swim in the private coves beneath the villa, where the water was so clear it felt like floating in air. Jacques would watch Nino dive, obsessively noting the play of muscle and light, storing these images in his mind like a miser hoarding gold coins. He was terrified that a single detail might escape him, that a shadow might fall differently tomorrow. The afternoons were dedicated to the preservation of this fleeting perfection. Jacques hired the best photographers of the era, men like Wilhelm von Plüschow, who shared his Uranian sensibilities. These were not casual snapshots. They were grueling, hours-long sessions where Nino was made to hold difficult poses, mimicking the statues of the Louvre or the Vatican Museum. He would stand unclad against a backdrop of ancient ruins, holding a clay amphora or a lyre, his expression blank and distant. To the modern eye, these sessions might seem exploitative, a wealthy man treating a human being like a doll. And in many ways, they were. But within the twisted logic of Jacques' obsession, this was an act of supreme devotion. He was trying to save Nino from mortality. He knew that flesh would sag, that eyes would dim, that the boy would eventually become a man. The photographs were a way to freeze time, to capture the essence of the boy god before biology ruined it. Nino, for his part, endured it all with a mix of Roman stoicism and the entitlement of a favored pet. He understood his job was simply to exist as the focal point of Jacques' adoration. He wore the togas, he held the poses, he accepted the adoration. But there was always a part of him, the street-smart Roman kid, that remained detached, watching the Baron with eyes that were older than his years. The interior of the Villa Lysis reflected this obsession. The library was vast, filled with thousands of volumes of poetry and history, But the centerpiece of the house was the large salon with its grand piano and floor-to-ceiling windows. Here, Jacques would host his evenings. Having been exiled from Paris, he now sought to bring a select slice of the world to him. He invited the eccentrics, the outcasts, the writers, and the artists who drifted through Capri. Norman Douglas, the acerbic British writer, was a frequent guest, as were various minor royals and wealthy bohemians who found the moral climate of the mainland too suffocating. But these guests were merely an audience. Jacques needed witnesses to his masterpiece. He would dress in flowing silk robes, playing the role of the decadent poet king. Nino would appear, sometimes silent, sometimes reciting lines of poetry he had been taught to memorize phonetically, his body draped in sheer fabrics that left little to the imagination. The guests would applaud, they would drink the Baron's expensive wine, they would whisper behind their fans, but they played their parts. They were extras in the grand movie of Jacques' life. Yet, the performance required fuel. Beneath the sunlit glory of the upper floors lay the heart of darkness, the Chinese room. The ritual was precise. The servant would prepare the pipe, heating the small ball of opium over a flame until it bubbled. Jacques would inhale deeply, and in the haze the stone walls would dissolve. Nino would often join him, lying on the cushions opposite, his eyes glassy. It was a macabre domesticity, two shipwrecked souls drifting together on a sea of smoke. But the opium had a price. It amplified the isolation. The monks of art, as Jacques liked to call himself and his circle, were becoming ghosts in their own home. The writing Jacques produced during this period, published in his own literary journal, Academos, became darker, more fragmented. He was trying to articulate a philosophy of pedestal love, a love that existed only in the contemplation of beauty, divorced from the messiness of physical reality. But the drug was eroding his ability to distinguish between the pedestal and the person. Outside the villa, the island of Capri viewed them with a mixture of awe and suspicion. The locals called Jacques il Barone. They knew he was incredibly rich and in the poverty-stricken south of Italy. That was enough to command respect, if not affection. He was generous with his money, funding local festivals, and overpaying for services which bought him a layer of protection. But there was always a distance. The fishermen crossing themselves when they passed the path to Villa Lysis, the mothers pulling their children closer. They sensed something unnatural up there on the cliff, something that went against the rhythm of life and death, something stagnant. Jacques felt this judgment, and it drove him deeper into his fortress. He began to cultivate a paranoia that the world was out to destroy his paradise. He installed iron gates. He narrowed his circle of friends. He became jealous, not just of people looking at Nino, but of the sun touching him, of the wind messing his hair. He wanted to put Nino in a glass case. There was a profound cruelty in this love. Jacques loved Nino, yes, but he loved him as one loves a masterpiece, not a human being. He did not ask Nino about his dreams, his fears, or what he wanted to do when he grew up, because in Jacques' mind, Nino was never supposed to grow up. Growing up was a betrayal. It was a defect. One afternoon, a crack appeared in the marble. Nino, perhaps bored by the endless posing and the stifling atmosphere of adoration, expressed a desire to visit his family in Rome, just for a week, to see his mother, to walk the streets where he wasn't a god, just a boy. The reaction from Jacques was disproportionate, a sudden shattering fragility. He viewed the request not as homesickness, but as an attempted escape. He wept. He raged. He offered Nino jewels, money, anything to stay. It wasn't that he forbade Nino from going, it was that he couldn't comprehend why Nino would want to go. Why leave Olympus to return to the mud? Nino stayed. He always stayed. The bond of gratitude, money, and perhaps a strange Stockholm Syndrome affection kept him tethered to the Baron. But the seed of doubt had been planted in Jacques' mind. He realized with a jolt of terror that his living statue had a will of its own. The clay could speak, and if it could speak, it could leave. To counter this fear, Jacques escalated the aestheticism. He planned even more elaborate parties, theatrical productions in the garden where Nino would play the lead roles. He invited more guests, needing the validation of the crowd to prove that his creation was real. He started writing a novel, a thinly veiled autobiography that sought to justify his life, to explain to a world that wouldn't listen that he was a martyr to beauty, not a sinner. But as the years ticked by, the shadows in the Villa Lysis lengthened. The opium smoke grew thicker, clinging to the curtains, permeating their clothes. The laughter on the terrace became a little more forced, the silence in the library a little more oppressive. The golden age of their exile was reaching its zenith, the sun hanging high and hot in the sky, burning everything it touched. Jacques looked at Nino one day across the breakfast table. The light was merciless. He saw, or thought he saw, the faintest line at the corner of the boy's eye, a microscopic imperfection, a sign that the enemy, time, had breached the gates. He didn't say a word. He simply stood up, walked to the basement door, and descended into the dark. He needed the smoke. He needed to blur the lens. He needed to stop the clock before it ticked again. The temple was built. The god was enshrined. But the worshippers were dying slowly in the very sanctuary they had created to save themselves. The years between 1905 and 1914 were supposed to be the golden afternoon of the Villa Lysis, a time of suspended animation where beauty was the only currency. But stagnation is a rot that starts from the inside. The very isolation Jacques d'Adelswerd Fersen had engineered to protect his paradise began to turn it into a prison. The silence of Capri, once soothing, grew heavy. The sun, once a blessing, became a relentless interrogator, exposing every new line on a face, every moment of boredom, every crack in the illusion. The problem was Nino, or rather the problem was biology. Nino Cesarini was no longer the 15-year-old boy Jacques had plucked from the streets of Rome. He was becoming a man. His shoulders broadened, his jawline hardened, and the soft androgynous grace of adolescence, the quality Jacques worshipped as Greek, was replaced by the dense muscular reality of a Roman laborer. He was handsome, undeniably so, but he was handsome in a way that was common, earthly, and terrifyingly adult. Jacques watched this transformation with a mixture of possessiveness and horror. He could not stop it. He could drape Nino in silk. He could pose him in the shade of the cypress trees. He could forbid him from doing manual labor, but he could not stop the testosterone from thickening his neck or the hair from darkening on his chest. Every morning Jacques looked at Nino and saw the death of his ideal. He didn't stop loving him. If anything, the attachment grew more desperate. But the nature of the love shifted. It was no longer the pure, aesthetic worship of a deity. It became the frantic, jealous clutching of a miser watching his gold turn to lead. To compensate, Jacques tried to intellectualize his existence. He founded a literary journal called Academos. It was a bold, expensive venture printed on high-quality paper, intended to be a rival to the established reviews in Paris. He wanted to prove to the world that he wasn't just a wealthy exile with a scandalous lifestyle. He was a serious thinker, a poet, a pioneer of a new sensibility. Academos was arguably the first publication in Europe to openly discuss homosexuality, albeit cloaked in the euphemisms of Platonism and aestheticism. For a brief moment, it gave him a purpose. He corresponded with writers like André Gide and Colette. He felt a flicker of the old ambition, but the venture was doomed. The subscribers were few, the costs were astronomical, and the stigma attached to his name was indelible. The literary world of Paris took his money but sneered at his pretensions. After a year, Academos folded. The failure hit Jacques hard. It was a confirmation that he was truly alone, that his voice mattered to no one. He retreated back into the villa, back into the silence, back to the only thing that didn't judge him, the pipe. Then the world ended. In August 1914, the guns of August shattered the silence of the Belle Époque. World War I did not just kill millions of men, it killed the very idea of the world Jacques lived in. The era of the dandy, the aesthete, the idle aristocrat was over. It was replaced by the era of the soldier, the mechanic, the trench. Capri, usually a haven, became a waiting room for the apocalypse. The foreign residents, the Germans, the Russians, the English, fled or were interned. The party stopped. The supply of luxury goods from the mainland became erratic. But for Jacques, the war brought a terror far more specific than shortages or social isolation. It brought the draft. Italy entered the war in 1915. The Italian army needed men. They didn't care about aesthetic theories or private paradises. They needed bodies to throw against the Austrian lines in the Alps. Nino Cesarini, fit, young, and Italian, was the perfect candidate. The conscription notice was a death sentence for Jacques. The thought of Nino, his Nino, the creature he had spent a decade protecting from the sun, from work, from reality, being shaved, shoved into a rough wool uniform, and sent to die in a muddy trench was physically unbearable. It wasn't just fear for Nino's life, it was a violation of Jacques' religion. To take a work of art and use it as cannon fodder was the ultimate blasphemy. Jacques tried everything. He used his remaining connections. He likely tried bribery. He feigned illnesses. But the machine of war was relentless. Nino was called up. The Villa Lysis, once a temple, felt suddenly empty, a hollow shell, echoing with the absence of the god who was supposed to inhabit it. Jacques fell apart. Without Nino, the structure of his day collapsed. There was no one to pose, no one to dress, no one to watch. The opium, which had been a way to enhance the beauty of the moment, became a way to obliterate the passage of time entirely. He smoked until he passed out, woke up, and smoked again. But opium is a slow drug, a drug of lethargy. It wasn't enough to numb the panic. It was during these war years that the white powder appeared, cocaine. If opium was the drug of the 19th century, romantic, hazy, dreamlike, cocaine was the drug of the 20th. It was sharp, fast, nervous, and electric. It didn't make you sleep. It made you stare at the wall with a heart beating like a trapped bird. Jacques began to mix the two. The champagne-cocaine cocktails became a staple. He needed the cocaine to lift him out of the opium stupor and the opium to calm the cocaine jitters. He was chemically managing his own sanity, balancing on a razor's edge between comatose and manic. Remarkably, Nino survived. He was eventually discharged. Some accounts suggest he was wounded, others that Jacques finally managed to pull enough strings to get him out. But the war had changed him. The man who returned to Capri was not the boy who had left. He had seen the world outside the villa. He had seen death, real death, not the romanticized love and death of Jacques' poetry. He had lived among men who didn't know or care who Baron Fersen was. Nino returned with a sense of his own power. He realized that Jacques needed him far more than he needed Jacques. The dynamic in the villa shifted irrevocably. Nino was no longer the silent muse. He began to make demands. He wanted more money. He wanted more freedom. He began to spend time in the village, drinking with locals, perhaps seeing women. Jacques tolerated it all. He had no choice. The fear of abandonment was greater than the jealousy. He became pathetic in his devotion. He bought Nino's affection with ever-increasing allowances. The Villa Lysis transformed from a temple into a gilded cage where the captive held the key. The end of the war, in 1918, brought no relief. The world that emerged from the ashes was ugly, cynical, and loud. The Jazz Age was beginning, but Jacques was a creature of the past. He was not yet 40, but he looked 50. His teeth were rotting from the sugar in the opium paste. His skin was gray. His hands shook. He was a ghost haunting his own life. The villa itself began to show signs of neglect. The marble was stained. The gardens were overgrown. The money was still there. The Fersen steel fortune was vast, but the will to manage it was gone. Servants stole from him. Dealers overcharged him. He didn't care. He only cared about the basement. The Chinese room became the only reality left. Jacques would spend days down there, lighting the lamp, preparing the pipe. He began to have hallucinations. He saw the police coming to arrest him again. He saw his dead father. He saw the boys from Paris. He saw Nino as he was at 15, frozen in golden light, mocking the heavy-set, brooding man who now walked the floors above. The artistic pretensions evaporated. He stopped writing poetry. He stopped reading. The library gathered dust. The only art left was the art of oblivion. He was conducting a long, slow suicide, measuring out his life in grains of white powder and balls of black paste. Yet, there were moments of lucid, terrifying clarity, moments when the drugs wore off and he looked around at the ruin of his life. He saw the broken furniture, the empty wine bottles, the indifference in Nino's eyes. He realized that he had failed. He had tried to stop time, but time had simply run him over. He had tried to build a sanctuary of love, but he had built a tomb. But there was one final complication. He wasn't just leaving a life. He was leaving Nino. And as the end approached, the question of what he owed his creation and what his creation owed him became the last bitter struggle of his existence. The stage was set for the final act, but the script was still being written in the smoke of the Chinese room. By 1923, the Villa Lysis had transformed from a sanctuary into a mausoleum for the living. The air inside the house was no longer filled with the scent of fresh flowers or the salt of the Mediterranean, but with the cloying chemical sweetness of decay. Jacques d'Adelswerd Fersen was 43 years old, but in the harsh, unforgiving light of the Italian morning, he looked like a man of 60. His skin, once the pale porcelain canvas of a dandy, had turned a waxen gray, stretched tight over cheekbones that seemed to threaten to puncture the flesh. His hands, which had once penned delicate verses and caressed the marble of ancient statues, now shook with a violent, ceaseless tremor that he could only still with a specific, deadly chemistry. The ritual of the champagne cocaine had moved from an occasional indulgence to a metabolic necessity. It was the fuel that kept the machine running. The opium pipe in the Chinese room was for the night, for the obliteration of consciousness, for the long, dark slide into oblivion, where he could pretend he was still the young, misunderstood genius of Paris. But the day required something else. The day required energy. It required a mask. Jacques would wake, if one could call the groggy emergence from a stupor waking, around noon. He would ring for his servant, and the tray would appear. It was a grotesque breakfast, a crystal goblet of champagne, usually a sweet pink variety that he had developed a fetishistic fondness for, and a small silver spoon heaped with white powder. He would dissolve the cocaine into the bubbles, watching the effervescence rise, a witch's brew for the Jazz Age. He drank it not for pleasure, but for survival. The mixture hit his bloodstream like a jump start to a dead engine. His heart would hammer against his ribs. His eyes would widen, and for a few hours the ghost would walk. He would dress with frantic, obsessive care. The suits were still impeccably tailored, the silk ties imported from Paris, the rings heavy and gold, but the clothes hung on his wasted frame. He was a scarecrow dressed in the finery of a prince. He would pace the marble floors of the villa, talking rapidly, his mind racing through 1,000 fragmented thoughts. He spoke of new books he would write, of travels to the Orient, of expanding the gardens. He was manic, driven by the artificial stimulant, trying to outrun the silence that waited for him in every corner of the house. Nino Cesarini watched this spectacle with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. The power dynamic had completely inverted. Nino was no longer the muse. He was the nurse, the keeper, and the hostage. He was a grown man now, thick-set, heavy-featured, a Roman laborer in a silk robe. The angelic softness was gone, replaced by the weary cynicism of someone who has seen too much. He had his own life now, a life that existed in the shadows of the villa's walls. There were rumors in the village of a woman, of a family he supported, of a future he was quietly planning for the day the Baron finally collapsed. Jacques knew this. The paranoia induced by the cocaine amplified his jealousy into a terrifying obsession. He saw betrayal in every glance. If Nino went to the village to buy cigarettes, Jacques would pace the terrace, tearing at his fingernails, convinced Nino was never coming back. When Nino returned, Jacques would descend on him, alternating between rage and pathetic weeping gratitude. He would shower Nino with gifts, gold watches, stacks of lira, jewels, desperate bribes to keep the illusion alive. "Don't leave me," he would whisper, the cocaine wearing off, the crash beginning. "You are all I have. You are my creation." But a creation cannot save its creator. The Villa Lysis was falling apart. The roof leaked, the plaster peeled in the damp sea air. The servants, sensing the end of the regime, became insolent. They stole silver, they drank the wine, they whispered in the kitchen. Jacques didn't care. He was living in a world of symbols, and the physical reality of the house was irrelevant. He was focused on the grand finale. The idea of suicide had been with him for years, a romantic abstraction, a literary device. But in 1923, it became a logistical project. He began to view his life as a novel that had dragged on a few chapters too long. The plot was exhausted. The characters were tired. The only artistic choice left was to write a perfect ending. He didn't want a messy death. He didn't want illness or old age to humiliate him. He wanted a voluntary departure, a term he used with a chilling calmness. He began to rehearse. He would invite the few remaining friends who would still see him, mostly other exiles, other wrecks of the Belle Époque, and talk about death as if it were a holiday destination. He read treatises on poisons. He discussed the aesthetics of different exits. "The Greeks knew how to do it," he would say, his eyes glittering with chemical fever. Hemlock, dignity, a conversation with friends, and then sleep. But beneath the philosophical posturing, there was a visceral terror. His body was failing. The combination of opium and cocaine was destroying his heart. He suffered from palpitations that left him gasping for breath on the floor of the Chinese room. His teeth were rotting. He had chronic gastric pain. The physical vessel of the aesthete was becoming repulsive. He would catch glimpses of himself in the mirrors he had once loved, the mirrors placed to reflect Nino's beauty, and he would see a monster, a bloated, gray, sweating monster with dyed hair and painted lips. He smashed several mirrors in the villa during these rages. He couldn't bear the truth. The turning point came in the autumn. The light on Capri changed, becoming sharper, colder. The tourists had gone. The island was returning to its elemental state of rock and wind. Jacques felt a sudden, crushing clarity. He realized that Nino was going to leave him. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. The biology that had turned the boy into a man would eventually turn the man into a husband, a father, a stranger. And when that happened, Jacques would be left alone in the ruins of his temple. He couldn't survive that. The thought of existing in a world without his living statue was more terrifying than death. If he died now, while Nino was still there, still bound to him by guilt and money, he could freeze the image forever. He could die as the master of the house, not the abandoned old man. He began to put his affairs in order. This was the final act of control. He wrote a new will. He left a significant fortune to Nino, enough to ensure the Roman would never have to work again, enough to buy his loyalty even from beyond the grave. It was a golden chain, forged to bind Nino to his memory. He left instructions for his funeral. He wanted no priests, no religious mumbling. He wanted to be cremated, his ashes scattered or kept in the villa. He wanted to remain part of the landscape he had built. The atmosphere in the villa during those final weeks was suffocating. It was a long wake for a man who was not yet dead. Jacques moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching the books he no longer read, the piano he no longer played. He spent hours in the Chinese room, but the opium no longer brought visions of Greece. It only brought darkness. He was smoking to unconsciousness, waking up drinking the pink champagne and repeating the cycle. He was trying to blur the edges of the world until it disappeared. Nino must have known. You cannot live with a man for 20 years and not know when he has given up. There is a specific silence that falls over a house when its owner decides to leave. Nino didn't stop him. Perhaps he couldn't. Perhaps he was too tired. Or perhaps in a dark, unspoken way, he knew this was the only way out for both of them. The tragedy had to end. The curtain had to come down. November 1923 arrived with a cold wind from the north. The sea turned a bruised purple. Jacques stopped going outside. He stopped eating. He existed on the champagne and the powder. He was shedding his physical form, becoming pure nerve and intention. He wrote letters to his mother in France, vague, wandering letters that spoke of fatigue and a desire for rest. He didn't tell her the truth. He wanted to spare her the scandal, or perhaps he simply didn't want anyone to interfere. On the final day, the villa was quiet. The servants were in their quarters. The wind rattled the shutters. Jacques dressed for the evening. He chose a robe of heavy silk, perhaps a shade of deep crimson or gold. He groomed himself, applying the makeup that hid the grayness of his skin. He went to the Chinese room. He didn't go down there to smoke. He went down there to wait. He had the bottle of champagne. He had the cocaine, a massive dose far beyond his usual tolerance. He sat on the divan, surrounded by the embroidered dragons, the silent witnesses of his long decline. He poured the wine. The bubbles hissed in the glass. He poured the white powder. It swirled, a snowstorm in a pink sky. He didn't drink it immediately. He likely sat there for a long time, holding the glass. He would have thought of Paris, of the apartment on Avenue de Friedland, of the first time he saw Nino on the streets of Rome, the sun catching the boy's dark curls. He would have thought of the poems he wrote, the lines about eternal youth and the cruelty of time. He was about to make his life into his final poem. He drank. The overdose was not a gentle sleep. It was a massive insult to the heart. The shock would have been immediate. The racing pulse, the constriction of the chest, the explosion of light behind the eyes. It was a violent chemical exit. He slumped back onto the cushions. The glass slipped from his hand, perhaps shattering on the stone floor, perhaps rolling into the shadows. Nino found him. The accounts of the discovery are clouded by history and legend, but the image remains stark. The lover, the muse, the creation, coming down the stairs to find the creator broken. Nino would have seen the body, the silk robe, the empty glass. He would have known instantly. There was no need to check for a pulse. The silence was absolute. But the story didn't end with the stopping of Jacques' heart. The death of the Baron was just the beginning of the final scandal. Because even in death, Jacques d'Adelswerd Fersen could not escape the world he had tried to defy. The local authorities, the press, the family in France, they were all about to descend on the Villa Lysis. The Temple of Love was about to become a crime scene. And Nino Cesarini, the boy who had been raised to be a god, was about to face the one thing Jacques had spent a lifetime trying to protect him from: reality. The silence that followed the crashing of the champagne glass in the basement of Villa Lysis was not the peaceful silence of a library or a church. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a crime scene. When Nino Cesarini descended the stone stairs into the Chinese room on the morning of November 6, 1923, he didn't find a sleeping poet. He found a ruin. Baron Jacques d'Adelswerd Fersen, the man who had styled himself as the last pagan emperor of Capri, lay slumped on the divan. The pink champagne, spiked with a lethal dose of cocaine, had spilled, staining the intricate embroidery of the cushions a dark, sticky crimson. His face, stripped of the flattering candlelight and the animating spark of his manic energy, was a mask of agony. The voluntary departure he had spoken of so elegantly to his friends had not been a gentle drift into the ether. It had been a violent, seizing cardiac arrest. The aesthetic illusion had finally shattered against the hard rock of biological reality. Nino stood in the doorway. He was 34 years old now, a man of heavy build and weary eyes. He looked at the body of the man who had plucked him from a Roman construction site 20 years ago, the man who had tried to turn him into a god, the man who had loved him with a suffocating, terrifying intensity. He didn't scream. He didn't faint. The accounts suggest he acted with a strange, numb practicality. He knew exactly what this was. He had watched the dress rehearsal for years. The first thing to die was the myth. The moment Nino called for help, the meticulously constructed private world of the Villa Lysis was invaded. The local doctor, Dr. Gualtiero, arrived not to save a patient, but to certify a corpse. Then came the police. The Carabinieri of Capri were accustomed to the eccentricities of the foreign nobility, but a dead baron with a history of drug abuse and moral turpitude was a problem. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. It was a polite fiction, a final favor bought with Fersen gold to spare the family the ultimate humiliation of a suicide ruling. But everyone in the village knew. The rumors flew down the mountain like wildfire. Il Baron had finally done it. He had overdosed on champagne and strange powders. Then came the sharks. Jacques' family in France, the steel magnates, the respectable bourgeois relatives who had shunned him for 2 decades, suddenly materialized. They didn't come to mourn the poet. They came to secure the assets. They were horrified by the Villa Lysis. To them, it wasn't a temple of beauty. It was a monument to perversion. They looked at the statues of Nino, the paintings of Nino, the photographs of Nino that lined every wall, and they saw only evidence of a wasted life. But Jacques had left a landmine, his will. In a final act of defiance, Jacques had left the usufruct of Villa Lysis to Nino Cesarini for his lifetime, along with a staggering sum of 300,000 francs. It was a fortune. It was enough to make the former newsboy one of the wealthiest men on the island. The Fersen family was apoplectic. They could not allow the servant, the symbol of Jacques' shame to inherit the ancestral wealth. They launched a legal war. They attacked Nino's character. They threatened to expose the nature of his relationship with the Baron in court, dragging the Fersen name through the mud once more if he didn't settle. Nino, however, was not the naive boy of 1903. He was a Roman. He understood power, and he understood money. He knew that the Fersen family wanted the villa and the scandal to disappear more than they wanted the cash. He negotiated. In the end, a compromise was reached. Nino would surrender his claim to the Villa Lysis. In exchange, the family would pay him a reduced but still substantial settlement of 200,000 lire. The transaction was cold and final. Nino packed his bags. He took his clothes, his few personal possessions, and the money. He left the marble halls where he had posed as a Greek god. He walked down the winding path to the harbor, boarded the ferry to Naples, and never looked back. He returned to Rome. He didn't become a poet. He didn't become an artist. He didn't use the money to build a shrine to Jacques. He did something far more shocking. He became normal. Nino Cesarini used the Baron's money to open a newsstand. It was a profound, almost ironic closing of the circle. The boy who had been discovered selling newspapers returned to selling newspapers. He married, he had a family, he grew old. Customers who bought their daily papers from the heavy-set, quiet man with the Roman accent had no idea that this was the Antinous of Capri, the boy whose face had been photographed by Plouchot, whose body had been immortalized in bronze, whose name was whispered in the salons of Paris as a synonym for forbidden love. Nino rarely spoke of the Baron. When asked, he would shrug. He was a strange man, he might say. He suffered. Nino died in 1943, in the midst of another world war, a respectable bourgeois shopkeeper. He had survived the obsession of a genius by becoming relentlessly ordinary. Back on Capri, the Villa Lysis began its slow descent into ruin. The Fersen family stripped the house of its valuables, the opium pipes, the Chinese silks, the first editions. Everything was sold or destroyed. The villa was left to the wind and the salt. The garden grew wild. The statue of Nino in the garden was eventually removed, lost to time. For decades, the villa stood empty, a haunted house on the cliff. The locals avoided it. Teenagers broke in to drink and tell ghost stories about the Pink Baron and his black masses. The roof collapsed. The plaster crumbled. The inscription Amori et Dolori Sacrum faded under the beating sun. It seemed that Jacques' fear had come true. The beauty had decayed. The memory had rotted. But history is strange. As the 20th century turned toward the 21st, a new generation discovered Jacques de Delswerd Fersen. They didn't see a pervert or a predator. They saw a tragic figure, a martyr to the intolerance of his time. They read his poetry not as decadent trash, but as a cry of loneliness. The Villa Lysis was restored, not by a family, but by the municipality of Capri and private donors. It was reopened to the public. Today, tourists climb the steep path to the villa. They walk through the restored salon. They look at the view that Jacques loved. They go down to the basement, to the Chinese room, now clean and empty of smoke. They take photographs, not of a crime scene, but of a sanctuary. Jacques de Delswerd Fersen failed to stop time. He failed to keep Nino young. He failed to escape death. But in the end, he won the only victory that matters to an artist. He is remembered. He turned his life into a story so compelling, so beautiful, and so sad that we are still telling it 100 years later. There is a legend on Capri that on certain nights, when the moon is full and the wind blows from the south, you can smell the faint, sweet scent of opium near the gates of Villa Lysis. It is said that the Baron never really left, but the truth is more poignant. Jacques' ashes were not scattered in the sea as he might have wished in a poetic moment. They were placed in a small urn in the non-Catholic cemetery of Capri. It is a quiet place, filled with the graves of other exiles, writers, painters, dreamers, who came to the island to find themselves and found only the end. His grave is simple. It does not list his titles. It does not mention his millions. It simply bears his name and the dates of his short burning life. Between those two numbers lies the entire arc of the Belle Époque, the rise of industrial wealth, the decadent rebellion of the spirit, the crash of the Great War, and the hollow echo of the Jazz Age. Jacques was the avatar of a specific kind of European soul, the soul that found the world too ugly to bear and tried to build a better one out of poetry and drugs. He was a monster to some, a victim to others. But looking back from the safety of the future, we can see him for what he truly was, a man who loved beauty more than he loved life. He built a temple to love and sorrow, and in the end, the sorrow consumed the love. As for Nino, the news agent of Rome, perhaps he was the only one who truly understood. He knew that you cannot live on a pedestal. He knew that gods eventually have to come down to earth or die. He chose the earth. Jacques chose the sky. And the Villa Lysis stands between them, suspended on the cliff edge, forever caught between the blue of the sea and the blue of the heavens, a white stone monument to a dream that was too heavy for human hands to hold.